As Miriam mentioned, my name is Emma Olson. I'm a first-year PhD student in history faculty, so I'm just getting started. So I think this will be more just an overview of my questions, methodologies, things like that. And then you'll have to come back next year to find out where it all leads. But I study the so-called Reconquista in the 13th and 14th century, Crown of Aragon, from sort of an interdisciplinary perspective that combines music and history. And if you're not familiar with it, the Reconquista was a series of violent military campaigns carried out by Christian kingdoms from the north of the Iberian Peninsula against the Muslim kingdoms that had been ruling there for centuries. And it takes a really long time. They just sort of slowly and very violently push south, establishing a series of frontier cities. And I'm looking specifically at the Crown of Aragon, which is on the eastern bit of the peninsula. And I'm especially interested in the city of Valencia. But as they conquer these cities, they're left with all the people who live there. So they have a Muslim majority, sizable Jewish and Mozarabic populations who are sort of accustomed to living under Muslim rule. And now we have all these Christian settlers who are trying to govern over them. And how this all worked is the subject of a lot of scholarly debate centered around a concept called convivencia, which is a term that's kind of been debunked, but it basically points to the idea of three religions living together, maybe in harmony, probably not, but more likely in sort of a constant, precarious series of negotiations over power and space and culture. And I'm hoping to come at this sort of well-worn convivencia debate from a perspective which I hope will let me see how the daily process of coexistence worked in a period when ideas of colonialism, identity, even religion are different than they are today, and that is sound. So sort of my central question is, what was the role of sound in defining and asserting religious identity in the Crown of Aragon? And I'm using the term sonic violence in this project right now. It's a term I'm borrowing from modern examples of sound being weaponized and sort of used in processes of othering and religious conflict. I'm not sure yet if violence is really the word I want, if it's the most productive term. I'm also kind of considering sonic encounter. But what I'm trying to capture, I think, is the way that sound is utilized by people in processes of encounter and mediation in conflict and domination. So I guess one question I'm also asking is about how this works in soundscapes. So we know that the first thing that Christian conquerors would do when they entered a city would be to install bells in the form of minaret. So they're not just imposing their presence, but they're also completely reordering a sense of time and space in these cities. So I'm really interested in how Christian rulers enforced an acoustic regime over frontier cities, but then also how Muslim and Jewish populations subverted those regimes. I'm trying to figure out what city to ask that for. I think it's probably going to be Valencia. But I'm not just interested in sound, I'm also interested in music, and specifically musicians. Because music is another space of encounter in these cities. So we know that there were municipal wind bands often employed by the cities. So I'd like to know who these musicians were, what they played, if they were Christian, if these were mixed faith ensembles. We don't know that much about Muslim and Jewish civic musicians besides that they were there, that they sometimes performed in churches. So I'd like to look into that. And so the question would be sort of how was civic music utilized by Christian authorities in religious ritual and civic ritual to again sort of impose their power over these cities. But I'd also like to look at the more professionalized music making of the troubadours, because in this region we also have the famous Occitan and Catalan troubadours. I'm specifically interested in their cervantes, which are political songs, and a subgenre of that is crusading songs. They sing a lot about Spain and the Reconquest. So I'm thinking about those songs as propaganda, but also maybe as sort of like a release valve, like a way of depicting violence musically to avoid the actual enactment of physical violence. The last thing I want to talk about is the question I get most commonly asked, which is how are you going to study sound for a period before there are tape recorders? And that is why this project is going to be very difficult. But I, so far, have sort of identified three different types of sources for sound. So one would be literary representations of sound, so things like biblical trumpets blowing down a wall. We know they didn't actually blow down a wall, but the fact that people wrote about them doing that tells us something about maybe what they thought sound was capable of. And then we also have sort of the cursory information about soundscapes, so regulations on the call to prayer. At different points, mosques are forced to switch to trumpets because invoking the name of the prophet was seen as too problematic. So things like that. There's prescriptions to priests on when to ring bells. These things tell us how people try to control the soundscape. And then we also have notated performances, so things like the troubadour poetry, but also notation itself. This is a period when musicians are experimenting with new ways of recording live performance on a page, which seems really obvious to us, because we take musical notation for granted. But there's lots of experiments going on with this at this time, and so I'm thinking about musical notation as an attempt to sort of control and regulate the human voice. And I'm hoping that by looking at all three of these sources and developing methodologies for each of them, I'll be able to get sort of a better idea of the process of communication between different faith groups in this really interesting time and place. Thank you.